Welcome to our symposium for 2023. In this annual event, we provide an opportunity for you to hear from leaders in our field about issues important in the research we do, as well as for clinical and prevention practitioners, and this year is no exception. We have known for a long time that adolescent brains are undergoing dramatic changes, but the trajectory in development is not a straight line. How is brain development affected by the environment and experiences youth have? And how does brain development affect their behavior? Today's guest has been working on answering these questions. To lead the discussion is Dr. Olu Ajilore, a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Illinois, Chicago. With both an MD and PhD degree from Stanford University, he has studied the effects of stress hormones on the brain, explored major depression through neuroimaging, and is currently using computational neuroimaging techniques and digital biomarkers to better track and treat neuropsychiatric disorders. So his background makes him a perfect person to talk with our symposium guest today about her work understanding adolescent brain development. And now here's Dr. Ajilore.
Thank you, Dr. Brody. As Dr. Galvan and I talk during this time, please feel free to email responses to symposium@uga.edu. That's symposium@uga.edu, or post in YouTube chat. We will address them as we can. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Adriana Galván, who's a professor of psychology at UCLA and director of the Developmental Neuroscience Laboratory. She is widely celebrated for her work examining the neural mechanisms underlying adolescent behavior and how this knowledge can inform public policy. Today, we will talk with her about what she has learned and is learning. Welcome, Dr. Galvan.
Hi, it's nice to see you.
It's great to have you here, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about your work and what you've learned about the adolescent brain. So I tend to work on the other end of the lifespan, working with older adults above the age of 60. What have you found in your work that makes the adolescent brain so special?
So many things, but one of them is that the changes in the brain during adolescence coincide with a lot of physical changes. And so you really can't dissociate the biological changes that are triggered by puberty with the socio-emotional changes that happen with the environmental context and the maturational changes in the brain. And so the confluence of all of these things make adolescence the perfect age to transition into the next phase of life, which is, of course, adulthood. And with adulthood comes new responsibilities, changing social landscapes. And so the adolescent brain is really primed to take on these new challenges and to seek social bonds outside of the family, outside of your school group or what have you. And so the adolescent brain is really good at seeking out novelty. There are changes in certain parts of the brain. One brain region is called the striatum, for example, that has traditionally been associated with increases in reward-seeking behavior, but we now know is so important for learning. And so the adolescent brain is really ready to take on new challenges as compared to younger children or older adults.
So some of those adaptations that have developed to make the adolescent brain sort of adaptive for that changing environment, are there any downsides to those special aspects of the adolescent brain that maybe make us more apt to have mental health issues during that critical time period?
Mm-hmm. It depends on who you ask, right? Adolescents would say that they have a newfound interest in taking risks or seeking out new social partners or romantic partners. Mm-hmm. But certainly, yes, you can't ignore the fact that there is an uptick in mental health onset during adolescence, particularly around anxiety or depression, and life circumstances like a pandemic might steer those trajectories in different ways. And, it's not simply because of changes in the brain, but as I mentioned before, the changes in social landscape make adolescents more aware of themselves, of where they fit in with society, of where they may be getting needs met or not met. And so all of these things may render them more likely to exhibit symptoms of mental health. And I know that parents and adolescents themselves, educators, are worried about this. Is this something that is normative, or are current conditions in our society creating conditions where adolescents have a greater increase in mental health? So it's hard to say, but certainly during this time, we do see an uptick.
And as somebody who also works as a clinician, I always wonder about sort of the role of neuroimaging and helping us make that distinction between what might be normative versus what might be more pathological or related to a disorder.
Yeah.
Have you found anything in your work or related work that suggests that some of these changes in the adolescent brain, that you can actually look at neuroimaging for signs of what might actually be abnormal versus what might be adaptive for the sort of normal changes that an adolescent is going through?
Yeah. Well, you said exactly what I would say, is that the brain is really good at adapting to the environment. And so if you've been raised in an impoverished environment or with a lot of adversity, your brain is really good at readjusting and saying, you know what, I should feel threatened in this context, or I should feel rewarded in this context. And so it is the case that there are particular conditions that are going to enhance or facilitate or protect any trajectories that may be of concern.
Mm-hmm. And related to that, you were talking a little bit about this altered social environment. And one of the things that's changed since I was an adolescent is sort of social media.
Yeah.
I wonder if you've looked at how that impacts adolescent mental health, and what might be some of the ways that are there healthy ways to engage with social media, or do what some parents do and say, look, you cannot be on Twitter, you cannot be on any of these social media platforms because it's not good for you.
Yeah. This is the biggest question right now, right? Is whether or not social media is negatively impacting the adolescent brain. And maybe surprisingly, given what our assumption might be, the data linking mental health to social media use are actually quite thin. And in part, it's because social media changes so rapidly, it's challenging to keep pace with how particular outlets like TikTok or YouTube, whatever it is, how they directly impact the developing brain. But what we do know is that there are many factors that influence how adolescents are going to behave and the state of their mental health. So while social media may be one component that will influence them, just as important are their school environments or their family life or things that that impact how they interact with others. One concern about social media, whether or not it's directly related, is asking, what is it precluding adolescents to do if they weren't on social media? Are they not engaging with peers face to face as much? Are they losing sleep? And that's an area of interest of mine in particular. And the jury's still out. The data on digital media is really in its infancy. And luckily, there's a lot of interest in examining this. But sometimes I wonder if the interest in social media follows the same pattern that we've seen historically about concerns over the use of television or regular phones, or many generations ago, even reading or access to books, whether and there was concern that those impacted negatively adolescent development. So is it just another wave of technology and concerns about that, or is it truly a unique influence is yet to be determined?
Yeah, so it sounds like because there's a lack of clear evidence that maybe some of these concerns are overblown. But I wonder how you would advise parents now with young kids in terms of whether there is actually a healthy way to engage with these apps.
Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah, that's what you said. So absolutely. I think that, well, first of all, as with any behavior, young people model parental behavior or, the behavior they see in society. And so kind of checking in on our own use is important. But also, as with any other behavior or skill that adolescents acquire during this time of life, adolescent or adults really serve an important function of showing them the appropriate or healthy way to engage in these behaviors, whether it is social media use or sexual behavior or driving behavior. All of these things are things we will eventually need to master. And because of this transition time during adolescence, it's a perfect opportunity to scaffold that skill development. That social media is a skill as anything else, I think.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think about with social media use and apps like TikTok, where they've really optimized the algorithm to have people engaged and sort of get that quote unquote dopamine hit every time they use the app. And I was thinking about how that intersects with your work on reward responsivity in adolescence, and wondering if the way these apps work, maybe they're actually optimized to kind of hook teenagers in a way that it won't hook adults. I don't know if you've looked at that or thought about that.
Yeah, well, I haven't looked at it directly, but I have thought about it. So I don't think that these social media companies have designed the tool to specifically target adolescents. But we do know that by very nature of the adolescent brain, whatever the reward is, whatever the stimulus is, whether it is social media or money or attractive faces or whatever it is, the dopamine system, which is a neurotransmitter that is responsive to reward, will be more reactive during adolescence. And for a long time, there was a negative narrative around that. The idea was that, well, adolescents are just a little bit wild because their dopamine is out of control. And the truth is that dopamine is more than just a reward signal, but it's also a learning signal. So whenever we learn something new, your brain releases a little bit of dopamine. And in many adolescent contexts, everything is new, everything is rewarding because they're learning about something. Right. And so whether social media is another way to learn about the world, maybe the number of likes you get, as adults, we say, why do you care so much about it? But from an adolescent perspective, social status is really important. It is adaptive for them to care about their cohort, about what their peers think of them. And this isn't just relevant for humans or for this generation, but across generations, across species. Gaining social status is one way to evaluate how you are relative to your conspecifics. So obviously, I'm extrapolating a lot from this question, but I think that our narrow focus on social media and maybe the negative ramifications may preclude our identifying ways in which, as you mentioned earlier, we can promote healthy use of the tool or the technology.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I often see technology as a double-edged sword, or it's a tool, right? It could be used for harm or it could be used for good. And I think
like any tool, right?
Right. We can't just throw it out, and we have to think about, if kids are using this already, how can we have them use it in a healthy way that promotes their mental health and not harm it in any way? So,
and there are good examples of that. So Nick Allen at the University of Oregon has a really fascinating tool aimed to identify when a young person may be in mental health crisis, or using the tool to predict when they will engage, have a mental health crisis. And that's, I think, one example of a positive attribute of the fact that they're going to be on the tool anyway, maybe monitor or evaluate their behavior while they're using it.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that you mentioned earlier, something that I've increasingly thought about, especially since I work in the city of Chicago, where there are a lot of stressful environments for kids to grow up in, where they're exposed to poverty and they're exposed to crime. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how your work informs maybe how these stressful environments may impact the developing adolescent brain.
Well, you probably know a lot more about stress than I do, but I think we both know that stress, first, let's be explicit about it, does impact the developing brain, right? That our brain has particular receptors or locks and keys that respond to our environment, whether that's positive or negative. And stress is not excluded from that. And so stress was developed over time in nature to motivate, right? To move, if you're in a particularly dangerous situation, to move out of it or to respond. But over time, if there's an accumulation of stress, the brain it's going to tax the brain into being in a high stress reactivity mode all the time. And that isn't just stressful for the brain, but for the entire body. Right. And so I wouldn't say that our goal is to minimize stress, but to create conditions in which particular adolescents don't have undue stress that will generate, disadvantage later.
Right. Absolutely.
What about you? What would your answer to that be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely has an impact. One of the analyses that we did recently was to look at the impact of neighborhood deprivation on the relationship between inflammation and
Mhm.
depression.
Mhm.
So it's been well established that people with depression tend to have higher levels of inflammation.
Mhm.
And we examined this relationship in participants who self-identified as white versus Black. And we found that those that identified as Black, we did not see this relationship between inflammation and depression that has been well established in the literature. And one of the reasons why we didn't see that relationship is that if you looked at our Black participants without depression, they already had high levels of
That's right.
these
Yes.
pro-inflammatory cytokines, the signs of inflammation, that were partially explained by these environmental factors, these
Mhm.
neighborhood factors, things like lack of access to healthy food, levels of crime, sense of belonging in the neighborhood. All
Yeah.
of these factors contribute to a stressful state that sort of decoupled the relationship between inflammation and depression.
That's really interesting. And that, everything that you listed is a basic need, right? We're not talking about stress like they're overwhelmed with schoolwork or something like that.
Right.
That too plays into it. But deprivation of basic needs is going to have important ramifications on people who are not receiving them and chronically not receiving them generationally, not just in their own family, but across, their history.
Yeah.
So that is the challenge. And how do we create systems and societies where people are not deprived of basic needs? And that's really a big challenge for our young.
Yeah, and increasingly, I'm glad to see this focus on sort of the structural determinants of mental health and thinking about things that we can manipulate in our environment to promote mental health. And related to that, I was thinking about what would you prescribe for society to do to support adolescent mental health based on your work and your understanding of what are the needs of the adolescent brain during development?
Well, I don't know if you're setting me up, but what I would say is something that folks might not think about, but I think sleep is one thing that all of us have access to and know what it is. And sleep is so important. I don't need to tell anybody, right? We all know as adults, as babies, when we have babies, how important sleep is for development and for emotion regulation and for learning, for attention. But during adolescence, there's a dip in the amount of sleep kids get. In part, a little bit is that social media, but actually not as much as you would think. A little bit of that is academics, but their brain is wired in a way where they don't get sleepy until later in the night. And so that coupled with early school time is going to compress how much sleep they get. But what we've done some research on sleep environments and looking across young people who live in different socioeconomic neighborhoods. And what we find is that the sleep conditions make a big difference, not just their motivation for sleep, but how comfortable is your bedding? How loud is the noise? Do you have good heat or cooling systems in the house? And this comes back to the basic needs that when we condition young people to not get good sleep because of the environments they are in, that's one, I think, relatively easy tool we can use for people to be most present in school the next day, to have better emotion regulation, to be paying attention. So I have a lot of interest in sleep. And, one thing we learned in a recent study is that kids who report not having a comfortable pillow have, I wouldn't say delayed brain development, but the brain connections are not getting formed as quickly as those kids who have optimal pillows or optimal mattresses. And relative to what we spend on a lot of other things, it seems like it would be a relatively simple intervention to ensure that the sleep environment is optimal for kids of all ages, kids of all socioeconomic status. So anyway, that's one thing I would say is important. And, one last point about that is that you probably know better than I, but the relation between sleep and mental health is really strong, regardless of age and regardless of disorder. If someone is suffering from anxiety or depression or something else, clinicians often ask, well, how are you sleeping? And they say, well, it's crap. It's so bad. And so it really is, whether it's a cause or an effect, almost maybe doesn't matter, but it is related to it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that, you highlighted the importance of sleep, because I think it's something that we don't we ask about clinically, but what we don't ask about is the environment that
Mm-hmm.
you referred to, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, do you have a comfortable place to sleep? Do you have a quiet place to sleep? Like,
Yeah.
all of those things we often don't consider, but are really important.
You have a consistent place to sleep.
Or a consistent place to sleep.
I
Exactly.
have
Yeah.
some of my research has been involved in the juvenile justice system, or incarceration and detention, and even very simple pictures paint a picture of very inadequate sleep conditions for young people who are incarcerated. The mattresses are very thin. Sometimes they don't
Right.
have a pillow. The lights are on all night. That is not conducive to good sleep. And
Right.
knowing the impact of sleep deprivation on emotion regulation, to take one example, well, it's no surprise then that there are impulsivity issues among
Mhm.
these kids. So I think we miss an opportunity to help young people thrive as much as they can by providing the basic needs that they need.
Yeah. Have there been any studies to look at whether, sort of improving the sleep environment for kids that are in the juvenile justice system lead to better, like less recidivism, less acts of, impulsivity or violence in those settings?
Yeah. Well, that's a study I want to do. That's my dream study,
Okay.
if anyone's interested in that. But I do have a collaborator in Texas who's not doing an intervention, but even simply an examination. What is the relation between these sleep conditions and these behavioral outcomes that
Right.
we're talking about? I suspect it's high.
Yeah, I suspect it's the same, and I think and I think you highlighted it very sort of correctly, that it's low hanging fruit as
Yeah,
far as an intervention that may be helpful and have a lot of impact in improving the mental health of a lot of kids.
exactly.
You
And
know,
it's so interesting because, sorry to cut you off,
go
but
ahead.
when our kids are young babies, infants, we care a lot about their sleep, right? If you do
Mhm.
a quick Google search about infant sleep, there's a lot of books, a lot of resources, consultants who come to your house and help you optimize their sleep. But once they become teenagers, maybe it's because parents start to feel as though this is one thing they could give up control over, right? They can say, okay, you set your own bedtime.
Mhm.
You can choose, if you use social media or not. And unfortunately, that has ramifications on how much sleep the young people are getting. And so that, the point is that they fall off. In our
Yeah,
insight,
yeah.
we asked, did you know that, Jimmy hates his pillow? They said, yeah, I never asked him. I had no idea that he was so uncomfortable every night. So that's a missed opportunity.
Right. But it's funny, though, you talk about how we sort of let kids determine their own sleep times, but we don't, when they go to sleep, but we don't let them determine when they wake up, right? Because of school.
Exactly. We don't determine. And, if you, in 2014, the American Academy of Pediatrics said, the data are inequivocal. You should absolutely start school later because the kids, whatever, it follows their circadian rhythm. Didn't really happen. Seattle was a good example of where it did happen, but despite the data, we don't acknowledge the circadian patterns of adolescents.
Why do you think that hasn't taken off more or been adopted by more school districts?
There are so many reasons. A lot of it has to do with the fact that this comes back to your earlier question about what makes the adolescent brain unique. The adult brain is not interested in sleeping in later. And so we are on an adult-based schedule. So adults work, parents work, and so they want their kids to start school when they start their work time. Also, there's concern that then kids wouldn't be open or available to do after-school sports, or that they would get more homework if it went later into the night. And so there's just a lot of coming back to the structural question, a lot of structural barriers to adopting a later school start time. But there are some schools that do that, but it's not as
But it
widely.
hasn't taken off like it should. Yeah.
No.
And so, related to sort of, public policy and society-wide implementation of changes in policy informed by the science, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the impact of your work on kids in the juvenile justice system, and whether people think about sentencing differently. They think about what is the goal of the juvenile justice system in a different way,
Yeah.
based on some of the work that you've done.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, things vary state to state. And so there isn't one universal adoption of any one principle, but originally the juvenile justice system was set up to support young people, right? To if they were in trouble or if they had made decisions maybe they shouldn't have made, that this was a way to rehabilitate. The pendulum really swung in the 80s and 90s, so that now the juvenile justice system or incarceration has seen an uptick in the number of young people who are tried as adults. And so in our work, focus on adolescent brain development, whenever I get called in to make, give testimony or opine on the juvenile justice system, it's about when is an adolescent an adult? And the other frame on that is when can I hold them accountable for a behavior they did when they were 17 or 18? And the age of majority in this country is 18. And we know that the adolescent brain continues beyond that. And so there's a natural tension between knowing the brain is still changing, that the plasticity or the malleability of the brain is still changing through the early 20s. And yet, if a person is incarcerated, let's say, and tried as an adult and found to be guilty and sentenced to life in prison, that is really precluding the opportunity for the development that we know will keep on going if they weren't incarcerated. Right. And so I think a lot about this very simple, seemingly simple question about when do we transition into adulthood and how can we sanction young people who should be accountable if they committed a heinous crime, but what is the appropriate sanction for individuals of this age group if the goal is to support healthy outcomes?
Yeah. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this sort of the time range of adolescence, right?
Yeah.
Because when I traditionally thought about it, before I learned more about the field, I thought about, a teenager as a teenager, right? 13 to 18 or 13 to 19. But, when we talk about adolescence from a more scientific standpoint, it's a broader range, right?
It really is. Yeah. And maybe we can show that first slide, or I think maybe it's the first or the second slide. Yeah. So this is showing that adolescence really spans the period of about age 10, when puberty first strikes for many young people, through about age 25. And so the first boundary is set by biological changes related to puberty and attaining your first menstrual period for girls, and say facial hair for boys. And the other upper boundary is a little fuzzier because it both incorporates brain development, which we know continues through the early 20s, but also the attainment of adult roles, being financially secure, stable, maybe finishing college or some higher degree or becoming a parent. All of these things are societally driven. And so how we decide who is considered an adult really varies by culture, by country, by a lot of different things. And so anyway, so that's all to say, it's hard to know when exactly adolescence starts and ends, which obviously comes into play in questions in the legal system. But the important thing to note from this slide is that there are distinct phases of development during adolescence. So obviously an 11-year-old is very different from a 19-year-old, and yet we kind of group them all together. So how can we as scientists support young people when there's such diversity in their developmental stage? And that's really, I think, a challenge and an interesting one for developmental scientists.
And what might be some of the things that influence that sort of rate of development? Or have you noticed, are there clear factors, either both internally, biologically, or externally from a societal standpoint, that might drive development to proceed in a faster fashion or a slower fashion?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. Well, certainly having an adult role or adult responsibility sooner rather than later will accelerate development. So I did some research. Well, actually, my graduate student did some research a few years ago examining young people who have responsibilities in their family, either. So in this case, it was Mexican-American adolescents who either did language brokering for their family or did a lot of childcare for their family. And what we found is that their brain development was distinct from their peers who didn't have these responsibilities. And so that's one example of how the environment helps shape the development of the frontal cortex. On the other hand, coming back to stress, there are some data showing that adolescents who have a very stressful environment undergo puberty sooner. And
Mhm.
that is so fascinating because there are so many evolutionary biology theories about why that happens, but the data are pretty consistent that that is the case. There are
Yeah.
also some links with ethnicity. So Mexican and Black youth are more likely to undergo puberty sooner than their white peers.
Mm.
And so,
And do you think that that's probably more culturally related? And I think what you highlight too is the importance of, doing these studies in diverse samples. There was a
Mhm.
recent paper by Jocelyn Ricard in Nature Neuroscience talking about how a lot of, especially large scale neuroimaging studies, have been hampered somewhat by not having diverse samples. I
Yes.
think the ABCD study has been much better at
Yes.
that.
It
I
has.
was wondering if you could talk about how you've worked to make sure that you have diverse samples involved in your studies.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And that was such an important paper to highlight this deficit in the field. And thank goodness there's acknowledgement of it, but we
Mhm.
do have a lot of work to do to make our studies more representative. So I'm at UCLA, as you know, and I am fortunate to be in a city as diverse as Los Angeles, where we can really reach those diverse populations. And so what we do is pretty simple strategies of partnering with folks in the community, with partner with different school districts. We also aim to have our consent forms and our procedures in Spanish and English. As you know, Los Angeles is
Mhm.
heavily populated by Latino populations. And so that has certainly helped. But as I mentioned, we have a lot of work to do because it's not simply the case of opening the doors for everyone and they will come. There's a
Right.
lot of work to be done in terms of establishing trust and establishing accountability to communities that have historically been not received that kind of treatment. And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
we try to think about it from that perspective as well. But I agree with you. These large data sets are doing a better job, at least acknowledging the need for
Right.
populations.
Right. So what are some of the ways that you've worked to establish trust in these
Mhm.
communities? And because I know I can imagine that it's a major barrier to getting people
It is.
involved. There might be some resistance.
Yes.
So what are some of the techniques that you use
Yeah.
to garner trust in the
Yeah.
community?
Well, I think it's one is to speaking with these communities with humility. So reaching out to the leaders of the communities, explaining what the goal is, explaining and acknowledging the historical suspicion reasons why there may be suspicious
Mhm.
of engaging with universities and research studies. I am fortunate to speak Spanish. I grew up in a I was going to say bilingual, but it's actually monolingual Spanish households, and so I very much appreciate that I can speak to them in
Mhm.
native language of Spanish. So I think that does some work to support. Um, Also, not simply sending research staff, although research staff are of course valuable, having the principal investigator of a study show up to be present,
Mhm.
answer the questions, I think goes a long way. But again, there's always work to be done, and it's a lot of relationship building.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've tried to do a little bit, and I've tried to do personally a little bit, is
Mhm.
talk about research in the community and to give something back, right? Whether it's
Mhm.
giving it back to an individual participant who participates in the study or to a larger community. And
Mhm.
and you've done a great job with science communication. I had a chance to look at some of your TED Talks. I was wondering if you could speak about that experience and what like the feedback has been like, what that was like for you.
Yeah, gosh, if I'd known that that was going to go up on YouTube, that first TED Talk, I would have I would have done it differently. But I think just realizing that as scientists, sometimes we're not trained in science communication, and
Mhm.
that we need to be, because it is there's obviously varying degrees of opinions on this, but as scientists, it is our responsibility to translate the science, because science is jargony and there's a lot of
Mhm.
challenging concepts and words to understand, but to make it accessible to the folks who are giving their time and effort and energy into providing us with the ability to understand better, in our case adolescents or mental health, is really important. And I just wish that in our graduate programs there was actually better intentional work on training us to communicate, either verbally or
Mhm.
in the written form or however it is. because it is such an important part of engaging with the folks we aim to support.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an important underappreciated part of the role of being a scientist is being able to communicate your findings to the general public and to give something back in terms of the knowledge that you've gained as part of your work. So I'm very glad to see that you've done that really well.
Thank you.
So one question I have comes out of so I have a bad habit of watching a lot of like kind of trashy TV. And so there's a show called The Parent Test. I don't know if you've seen it, but basically it's a competition game show where different parenting styles are pitted against each other, right? So you have the helicopter parents, the free range parents, the disciplined parents, the negotiation parents, and the child-led parents, all sort of vying for who has the best parenting style. And they face different challenges with their kids of different ages. And I was thinking about like, what style do you think works best in managing the adolescent brain, given all the things that you highlighted about what's special about it?
That's a really good question. And I love to hear that there's developmental science in TV. That's really funny. I should really check it out. Well, the answer is that obviously no one parenting style is going to be a magic bullet, and youth don't grow up in a vacuum anyway. So even if we said, okay, this is the parenting style that's going to work, it's not going to work for everyone. And not just because each individual has their own biology and history and way of viewing the world, but because parenting is one aspect of what's going to contribute to their developmental trajectory. School, community, friends, all of those things are going to impact it. And not all adolescents are obviously going to respond in the same manner. So kind of having, I don't remember what you said, but like the free range parent may work with child number one, but not with child number two. And that's certainly the case in my family, where I have two kids, and I work for one and not for the other. But what is important, regardless of the parenting style, is that it is established before the young person becomes an adolescent, right? You can't swoop in as, now you're an adolescent parent and be very, discipline driven or, the opposite. And so establishing those relationships before is obviously very important. And that also comes back to the social media question about being along with them on the journey of whatever skill they're trying to acquire should happen sooner rather than later. But we also know that sustaining the parent-child relationship is equally important during adolescence. Sometimes there's a misconception that as young people become teenagers, they don't care about their parents or focus on their friends. And there's actually really great work by Eva Telzer, who's at UNC, showing that parents remain as important to the young person as friends do, and as they were before they were teenagers. And so I guess the message is, don't give up on trying to be their friend or trying to be their support system, because the connections are just as valuable as before.
But it's really interesting that you talked about the sort of consistency of parenting throughout development, even pre-adolescence into the adolescent period, that it's important to maintain that consistency, even though your child is changing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what's hard, right? Because as they change, you want to change too, right? If they become more rebellious, you want to become more combative. And so that's really hard, but it's what the
That's very interesting. So what are you working on now that you're really excited about?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned before, the sleep stuff, I love it. I think sleep is so important. We're finding new ways to monitor sleep in the natural environment, but that's one thing. Another thing I'm really excited about is I have a collaborator named Tara Paris, and we've been doing a study of starting with kids at age 9 who showed signs of anxiety. And we followed them for a few years now. It's been 3 or 4 years. And initially, we were interested in examining the factors that exacerbate the anxiety. So if they show signs of anxiety at age 9, by the time they're 11 or 13, what made their anxiety worse? But what we find is that we've become more interested in the factors that diminish their anxiety. So what are the protective factors? One of them is sleep, unsurprisingly. That's because I look for it, but that's not the only thing. But other things are what I just mentioned, strong family support systems. Having one consistent best friend is a really good predictor of the resilience or I wouldn't say aging out of anxiety, but managing the anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And so we haven't finished the study, but we've simply become more interested in on the flip side, right? We always kind of think about mental health exacerbating, but as you mentioned earlier, there's adolescence is a time of dynamic change in mental health. So some go up and some go down. And so focusing in on how we can lift up the factors that diminish poor mental health may be a way to go.
Right. And relate, I'm so glad that you're focusing on these resilience factors and things that might mitigate risk for developing mental health problems, because I think we often focus on the negative so much that we don't think about what are things that people do to support their own mental health. And so I think that's really great. And have you thought then about how those resilience factors might be either implemented or supported or developed as an intervention? I know we talked a little bit about sleep, but these other ones that you mentioned, I think it would be kind of interesting thinking about how to develop interventions or supports around those factors.
Exactly. Yeah. So one thing we found, and this is kind of related to a different study I'm working on, is on pro-social behavior. So we know that among adults, engaging in pro-social behavior or altruism when you're feeling down really lifts you up. And that hasn't been examined so much in young people, but in our data, we find that those who report volunteering or just naturally inclined to support their friends, it boosts their own feelings, positive feelings. And leveraging the fact that adolescents are inclined to hang out with their peers or really have an interest in forming social bonds, perhaps that could be an intervention to see, if we actually support it instead of saying, you're too much hanging out with your friend, would we support their, feelings of anxiety or depression or whatever else?
That makes a lot of sense. And have you worked, or have you talked with schools about ways to sort of maybe develop programs or systems to sort of create these opportunities for kids to do this within the school environment?
That would be amazing. We have not, but that would be such a great thing. But there are some scholars who have been able to leverage their knowledge into school-wide systems. So Betsy Palick, I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she's at Princeton, and she's amazing. She studies networks and social networks and has been able to go into every school in New Jersey and introduce an intervention whereby people are doing, this kind of thing that I'm talking about, pro-social behavior. And she doesn't look at their brain development or anything, but she simply sees changes or decreases in antisocial behavior among the kids who are most integrated into the social network. So all that is to say that we should leverage what adolescents are naturally good at, which is to seek out rewards, to hang out with their friends, and to be a part of a group, rather than, penalizing it.
That makes perfect sense. And related to that, I was thinking about especially in the Chicago area, there's been a lot of attention to bullying and student mental health. And I was wondering if you've seen in your own work or related work, whether bullying is something, when I think about it, what comes to mind is usually younger kids, like pre-adolescent. I was wondering if it's something that changes as we move into the adolescent years. Does it get better? Does it get worse as we get into those teenage and older years?
It's a good question. Well, I think, I don't know the numbers in terms of quantifying the magnitude of the bullying, but certainly the way bullying plays out may change. One is that as they use social media more so, that may impact, the medium by which bullying happens.
Right.
But also there's different forms of bullying. So there's well-established literature on girls versus boys in terms of the bullying that they experience. And with girls, it's more likely to be relational bullying and, gossiping and things like that. And so I think, just really paying attention to the ways in which people, not just young people, hurt each other is really important.
Yeah. But going back to what you mentioned before with, enhancing pro-social behaviors, enhancing positive, rewarding experiences for teenagers, I think, is definitely the way to go. And, I think about my own adolescence and the rewarding experiences that I had doing volunteer work. And, you know, I was even reminiscing about some of the work that I did as a teenager doing volunteer work with the American Red Cross, and what a positive experience that was.
Yeah, or even working, not even volunteer work, but working. I really, same thing. I had such positive experiences from having an after school job and feeling like I was contributing to my family, which is another form of activism, right? Is feeling as though your behavior or your thoughts matter is also
absolutely,
really
absolutely. So I think we have a question from the audience.
Okay.
It's what are some important next steps for research about adolescent health?
Well, I think that I'm going to ask you the same question in a second, but you know, from my perspective, some of the important next steps is acknowledging that adolescent health matters. So, if, for example, if we recently did a scan, I'm a part of the Center for the Developing Adolescent at UCLA, and we just recently did a scan on the governmental dollars that are spent on adolescent health or health among people who are developing. For infants and young children, it's pretty high. We're doing pretty well on how much we invest in their health. But for adolescents, there's a dip. You know, there are many caucuses in government. There's not one adolescent caucus. And I think that's really telling about how we think about adolescents. And in part, it's because they are in this transition phase. Are they children? Are they adults? And that leads to this, you know, kind of ambiguity about where the investment should go. But I think that's an important next step for adolescent health.
Yeah.
What about you? What
absolutely. So, I mean, I think building up those resilience factors, I think, are really important. At our institution, University of Illinois, Chicago, we have the Urban Youth Trauma Center, which is designed to give kids who have been exposed to violence tools for managing their mental health, so it doesn't lead to PTSD, it doesn't lead to depression, given the sort of, you know, horrendous environmental circumstances that a lot of these kids are growing up in. So I think the more that we can do to build resilience, as well as try to address the original traumatic events in the first place, I think that's definitely where we need to put a lot of resources towards.
I agree. And along with what you just said is also a story of acknowledgement, right? Like if you are giving them tools for building up the resilience, that's acknowledging that what they're facing.
Exactly.
Typical. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. I think that's a really good point. And I think we're even kind of hopefully expanding our sense of what trauma could be or what it could mean, especially for younger folks. That, you know, that things that we traditionally consider trauma has been too limited to encompass some of the things that we see clinically in a lot of these adolescents, especially here in Chicago.
Yeah, I think you make an important point. And, you know, just even societally, how current events impact young people's development. Mental health is really important. So obviously the pandemic is one good example, but I've recently been in conversation with a lot of people examining what they call eco-anxiety. So concerns about the environment. And young people are at the forefront of thinking about climate change, for example, as opposed to some adults. And so acknowledging the fact that they're experiencing the world in a different way will also, you know, help us better support them.
Yeah, absolutely. Or even thinking about, you know, the terrible sort of epidemic of school shootings, right? I mean, and having young kids having to do active shooter drills in preschool, that in and of itself can create a lot of this trauma.
That's exactly right. And the message is sent that the world isn't safe, right? That if we have security guards posted everywhere, I recognize why there feels to be a need for that, but it does send a different message about what safe is.
Absolutely. I believe we have another question from the audience. This is from Don Bauer. Please speak to precocious puberty and brain development.
Yeah, this is such an interesting question. So just for those who may not be as familiar with precocious puberty, it's the notion that some kids undergo puberty earlier than is typical for their peers. And precocious puberty is interesting. It seems to have different effects on males versus females. So for females, precocious puberty has been associated with higher rates of mental illness or symptoms like anxiety and depression, whereas for males, less so. And, you know, the relation to brain development has not been studied very well. And the focus has instead been more on, are the kids with precocious puberty undergoing higher levels of stress? And that does seem to be the case. But again, the data are pretty thin on that. But yeah.
That's really fascinating. Any thoughts of, so you said the sex differences might be related to levels of stress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
And has there been any further work to look at where the sources of that stress differential comes from?
No, I mean, a lot of it is socioeconomic stress that has a lot to do with it, but just the trauma that we were talking about earlier.
Great. So we have another question, and this is about whether the kind of research that you do, can you do that without an R01?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, the related question, MRIs and biologicals are expensive to do. That's absolutely right. They are so expensive to do. And, I am fortunate to have grants to do fMRI research, but I will admit that I often ask, what is the added value of doing the MRI, right? If I'm interested in the relation between sleep and anxiety, it's nice to have a potentially mechanistic understanding from the brain, but I don't actually need that to link sleep and anxiety. I don't need the brain to show that an intervention will ameliorate anxiety symptoms if we improve the sleep. And so the answer to this question is, I hope a feel-good one, that the research can't be done without an R01. And I've often found that the smaller grants that I receive, maybe because the dollars are tighter, that I find sometimes the research is better. So my interest in sleep evolved actually when I became a parent and was not getting sleep. I really wondered about that. But before that, so I got basically a training grant, a seed grant with very little money to start studying sleep. And that really kicked off a whole area of research on the smallest grant I had received. So anyway, but what do you think, Olu?
Yeah, so one of the things that we do in our studies is that we're fortunate also to get grants to do the expensive MRIs, but we're trying to link it with other measures that might be more easily implementable and disseminable. So like, using ecological momentary assessment, where we track how people are doing on their smartphones, or using passive sensing from Fitbits, or, a colleague of mine, Dr. Alex Liao, developed an app called BiEffect that tracks how you type on your phone. And so we can infer information about, mood states and cognition. And what we're trying to do is link that to what we measure in the brain with MRI, so that if the digital biomarkers are a good proxy for what we can measure with MRI, then we don't need MRI.
That's right.
To get some of the same insights, right?
That's exactly right.
So that's some of the work that we're doing now to see if we can use these, cheaper, more ubiquitous types of technology to substitute for what we can measure with MRI and more expensive methods.
And I would add that the methods that you mentioned are more ecologically valid, right?
Right, absolutely.
These are happening in the natural, realistic environment, whereas the MRI is obviously a very artificial environment. The tasks that you present when they're in the scanner are maybe not typical to what you're trying to really measure. So the MRI gives really pretty pictures that may not always be necessary.
Yeah, but I think we're seeing a lot more work kind of linking the two. I have one of my colleagues, Dr. Cope Fuhrer, she's interested in stress generation and stress and its relationship to depression in teens. And so she's doing ecological momentary assessments while the kids are in school.
Oh, wow.
And then linking that to, measures of stress in the scanner. And so I think the more we kind of link these two types of measures, the more we can use those cheaper technologies.
Yeah, exactly. But great question.
Yeah. All right. So I'm trying to see if we have any more questions from the audience. I don't see any, but it's been a real pleasure talking with you and talking about all of your exciting work. And I really look forward to seeing what further is going to come out of your lab. And when my daughter becomes a teenager, I will let her sleep in.
How old is she now?
She's 7.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you have a little way to go.
Yeah.
You have some time, but establish the sleep habits now, like I do with my kids. I think it's
absolutely.
Really
So let me, I think I'm supposed to wrap up here, but I lost my my wrap up message.
Okay.
So thank you, Adriana, for talking with me today about your work. It's fascinating and important area of research, and as we look forward to more from you in the future, a recording of this discussion will be available on the CFR YouTube page and website, and we encourage you to share it with others who may be interested. Thank you for listening, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Bye.